From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The occupation of Palestine also depends upon an occupation of American public opinion. That unless the American government is aboard with this and acts as a protector of Israel, then that occupation is not possible.
Not backing down, Israel free speech in the battle for Palestinian human rights. That's the title of an event set to take place Saturday at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. After 3 anonymous UMass students filed a lawsuit to stop the event, a judge ruled Thursday the event can proceed, saying, quote, "There's nothing that comes even close to a threat of harm or incitement to violence or lawlessness." We'll be joined by Roger Waters, one of the participants on the panel, co-founder of the popular rock band Pink Floyd.
That is their standard go-to response, is to call you an anti-Semite, to start calling you names, and hopefully to discredit you.
Then 2 award-winning teachers try to teach Trump a lesson. We'll speak with the 2019 Teachers of the Year from Kentucky and Minnesota. They're boycotting this week's White House ceremony honoring them.
Immigrants are here seeking asylum, seeking peace, and truly seeking better lives. So when the administration then turns and calls people like my family animals and dehumanizes people like me and my own, I cannot in good faith go and smile and shake their hand.
And it's the 100th anniversary of the birth of the late folk singer Pete Seeger. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has accused Attorney General William Barr of committing a crime by lying to Congress.
He lied to Congress. If anybody else did that, it would be considered a crime. Nobody is above the law, not the President of the United States and not the Attorney General. Being the Attorney General does not give you a bath to go say whatever you want, and it is the fact because you are the Attorney General.
Speaker Pelosi alleges Attorney General Barr lied when he told Congress he did not know whether Special Counsel Robert Mueller supported his preliminary public description of the Mueller report. Lawmakers learned this week Mueller had written Barr a letter saying his summary of the report, quote, did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of his work. A Justice Department spokesperson said Pelosi's comment was, quote, reckless, irresponsible, and false. Meanwhile, Jerry Nadler, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, is threatening to hold Barr in contempt for refusing to comply with a subpoena for the full redacted Mueller report.
We will continue to negotiate for access to the full report for another couple of days. And yes, we will have no choice but to move quickly to hold the Attorney General in contempt if he stalls or fails to negotiate in good faith.
Congressmember Nadler made the threat after William Barr refused to appear before his committee on Thursday. A Category 4 cyclone has smashed into northeastern India with winds over 100 miles per hour. Forecasters predicted it would be the strongest storm to hit India in over 20 years. Over 1 million people have already been evacuated from coastal regions. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced plans to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov next week to discuss the crisis in Venezuela. The U.S. and Russia have each accused the other of meddling in Venezuela's affairs. On Thursday, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro appeared on national television flanked by military commanders in the latest sign that he maintains the support of the military in the wake of the U.S.-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido's attempted coup on Tuesday. Meanwhile, a Venezuelan court has issued an arrest warrant for opposition politician Leopoldo Lopez, who escaped house arrest earlier this week on the same day his protege, Juan Guaido, attempted to launch the coup. Lopez is now staying in the Spanish ambassador's residence in Caracas, Venezuela. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., 2 activists were arrested outside the Venezuelan embassy Thursday as they attempted to throw food inside the building, which people have been occupying to protest U.S.-backed efforts at regime change. While critics of regime change remain inside the embassy, backers of Guaido have surrounded the embassy, preventing food supplies from getting into the activists. The European Union is threatening to sue the United States and the World Trade Organization over the Trump administration's move to allow U.S. nationals to sue any company that does business in Cuba using private property seized during the Cuban Revolution. The Carnival Cruise Lines became the first U.S. company to be sued under a provision in the 1995 Helms-Burton Act, which went into effect on Thursday. In news from Capitol Hill, the Senate's failed to overturn President Trump's veto of legislation that would have ended U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which has killed thousands of civilians and sparked the world's worst humanitarian crisis. This comes as the United Nations warns the death toll in Yemen could reach 233,000 if the war continues through the end of the year. This is Senator Bernie Sanders speaking Thursday just before the vote.
The war in Yemen right now has led to the worst humanitarian disaster on the face of the earth. There are studies out there which unbelievably tell us that hundreds of thousands of people will starve to death by the end of 2019 if we don't stop this war. What we are trying to do, and for the first time have used the War Powers Act in an effective way to get the United States out of an unauthorized war.
Julian Assange has officially begun his fight to avoid extradition to the United States. The WikiLeaks founder told a London court Thursday he will not voluntarily consent to being extradited to the United States to face charges related to the Chelsea Manning leaks. Speaking by video link from jail, Assange said, quote, "I do not wish to surrender myself for extradition for doing journalism that has won many awards and protected many people." Julian Assange was arrested in April after spending 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London in political exile. After the court hearing, Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, warned his extradition could put a massive chill on investigative journalism.
Despite what you heard from the prosecutor in the courtroom today, this case is not about hacking. This case is about a journalist and a publisher who had conversations with a source about accessing material, encouraged that source to provide material, and spoke to that source about how to protect their identity. This is protected activity that journalists engage in all the time, and any prosecution and extradition of Mr. Assange for having done so, or alleged to have done so, will place a massive chill on investigative journalism the world over.
The Pentagon is facing accusations it's drastically underestimating the number of civilians being killed in U.S. airstrikes overseas. On Thursday, the Pentagon released a report saying the U.S. had killed 120 civilians in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia last year. However, the watchdog monitoring group Air Wars says the total is at least 10 times higher. In Iraq and Syria, the Pentagon admitted to killing 42 people, but Air Wars put the civilian death toll from attacks by the U.S.-led coalition at over 800. A new report on global military spending finds the United States spent $649 billion last year on its military. That's nearly as much as the next 8 countries combined. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's report, known as SIPRI, found China spent the second most at $250 billion, followed by Saudi Arabia, India, and France. The Children's Defense Fund is warning nearly 13 million American children are living in homes with incomes below the poverty line, even as the richest Americans benefit from tax cuts passed by the Republicans in 2017. Meanwhile, a new report by Temple University's Hope Center finds more than half of U.S. college students have struggled to find housing, and almost half have experienced hunger at some point in their college careers. Facebook announced it's banned Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, as well as several right-wing figures, including conspiracy theorist Alex Jones of InfoWars, former Breitbart columnist Milo Yiannopoulos. In a statement, Facebook said, quote, "We've always banned individuals or organizations that promote or engage in violence and hate, regardless of ideology," unquote. Several prominent hip-hop artists, including Snoop Dogg and Chuck D, criticized Facebook for banning Farrakhan, who organized the Million Man March in 1995, but has long been accused of making anti-Semitic remarks. President Trump has dropped plans to nominate the right-wing economic commentator Stephen Moore to the Federal Reserve Board. Moore had come under intense scrutiny over past comments about the role women in society and for withholding hundreds of thousands of dollars in alimony to his ex-wife. Interior Secretary David Bernhardt has announced plans to roll back a number of safety regulations on offshore drilling put into place after the deadly 2010 Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf of Mexico caused the worst oil spill in U.S. history. The chief oil lobbying group, the American Petroleum Institute, pushed to weaken the safety regulations. The move is expected to save the oil industry over $800 million over 10 years. Bernhardt is a former oil lobbyist. In medical news, the billionaire founder of Insys Therapeutics has become the highest-ranking pharmaceutical executive to be convicted in a case linked to the U.S. opioid epidemic. A federal jury in Boston convicted John Kapoor and 4 other colleagues of bribing doctors to prescribe a highly addictive fentanyl spray to patients who didn't need it. One of the defendants allegedly gave a lap dance to a doctor at a company event in order to persuade him to prescribe the drug. They face up to 20 years in prison. Baltimore Mayor Catherine Pugh has resigned amidst a growing investigation into her business deals. Last week, the FBI and IRS raided her 2 homes and her City Hall office. Part of the probe centers on the mayor making more than $700,000 by selling large numbers of her self-published children's books to businesses seeking city contracts and to the University of Maryland Medical System, where she served on its board of directors. In Sudan, hundreds of thousands of protesters took part in another mass sit-in Thursday outside Sudan's defense ministry. The protesters are calling for civilian rule following last month's military coup that ousted longtime leader Omar al-Bashir.
It took us 4 years of protesting to reach this point. We persevered through security forces and bullets and everything. Ramadan would never let us give this up. We will persevere through Ramadan under any pressures, under any challenges. We will persevere until all demands are met.
In news from the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas, a 10-month-old Honduran infant has died, and 3 people are still missing, including 2 children, after a rubber raft overturned in the Rio Grande. Survivors say the raft was carrying 9 people as they attempted to cross the border. The Florida Senate has passed a bill that would require former felons to repay all financial obligations before their voting rights are restored. This comes 6 months after voters in Florida overwhelmingly approved a measure to restore voting rights to 1.4 million people with nonviolent felonies who have fully completed their sentences. 1 in 5 African Americans in Florida and 10% of Florida's adult population have been ineligible to vote because of a criminal record. In environmental news, the state of Maine has become the first state to ban food containers made of styrofoam. Democratic Governor Janet Mills said, quote, polystyrene cannot be recycled like a lot of other products, so while that cup of coffee may be finished, the styrofoam cup it was in is not. In fact, it'll be around for decades to come, and eventually it'll break down to particles, polluting our environment, hurting our wildlife, and even detrimentally impacting our economy, she said. The words of Maine's Democratic Governor Janet Mills. The ban goes into effect in 2021. A cruise ship owned by the Church of Scientology has left the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. The ship had been quarantined after a case of measles was reported on board. The ship left the port after health officials on St. Lucia provided 100 doses of the vaccine. The ship is now heading to Curacao. It's unclear whether the people will be able to disembark there. In Seattle, Washington, dozens of people rallied this week at the immigration court where prominent activist Marumora Villalpando was ordered to appear. It was her 3rd hearing since ICE moved to deport her last year after she organized a series of resistance workshops across Washington state. The judge set another hearing date for November, and Mora Villalpando vowed to return with more protesters.
I think that in a way, coming to this building to show the epicenter of the tensions and deportations in Washington, it's definitely part of our work, and it benefits our work because most people didn't know that this place existed in the first place. They have no idea that this private building hosts many offices of ICE, Homeland Security Investigations, and Department of Justice. Here's where decisions are made. And we're very happy to bring people here every time we come and for people to understand that this is another place of resistance.
Villalpando also has a pending civil rights lawsuit challenging how ICE surveils, detains, and deports outspoken immigrant activists. The case cites the arrest of well-known New York activist Ravi Ragbir at his regular ICE check-in. Last week, a federal appeals court ruled in favor of Ragbir in his own free speech case, saying the First Amendment bars ICE from targeting activists for deportation based on their political speech, writing, quote, "To allow this retaliatory conduct to proceed would broadly chill protected speech among not only activists subject to final orders of deportation, but also those citizens and other residents who would fear retaliation against others," the court wrote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Western Massachusetts, where a judge ruled Thursday a panel on Palestinian rights can move forward. Not backing down: Israel, free speech, and the battle for Palestinian human rights. That's the title of the event set to take place Saturday at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. 3 anonymous UMass students filed a lawsuit to stop the event, claiming they will, quote, "suffer irreparable harm if it takes place." But Judge Robert Ullman ruled Thursday the event can proceed, saying, quote, "there's nothing that comes even close to a threat of harm or incitement to violence or lawlessness," he said. Meanwhile, the university has backed the event, despite the protests, saying it's committed to the principles of free speech and academic freedom. The event is co-sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace. Group member and attorney responded to Thursday's decision, saying, quote, "The judge ruled that to shut down this event would be to violate the First Amendment. But we also challenge the false premise that criticism of Israel is somehow inherently anti-Semitic. We have every right to criticize Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights. As members of JVP and as Jews, we stand in solidarity with the event and with the panelists," Rachel Weber said. Saturday's event will include several high-profile speakers, including Palestinian-American activist Linda Sarsour, who has faced death threats for her outspokenness, and Temple University professor Mark Lamont Hill, who was recently fired from CNN for speaking up for Palestinian rights. It will also include our guest today, who's joining us in our New York studio, Pink Floyd founder Roger Waters, co-founder of the group Pink Floyd. Also joining us, Rachel Weber, attorney and member of Jewish Voice for Peace of Western Massachusetts. And from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, we're joined by Sut Jolly, professor of communication at the university and founder and executive director of the Media Education Foundation, which organized the event. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Sut Jolly, let's begin with you. Thanks for joining us from your school, from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Can you explain what has taken place since the announcement of this panel for May 4th?
Yeah, good morning, Amy. Yeah, it's been a firestorm of criticism since we announced the panel. I know that the Chancellor and the administration have received scores of telephone calls protesting the event. The Massachusetts Republican Party has protested the event and wants to be cancelled. There was a letter written by 80 organizations, 80 right-wing organizations, demanding that the event be cancelled and that the university disassociate itself from anything to do with the event. And of course, as you just mentioned, there was this lawsuit that was filed by this right-wing organization on this, spurious notion that somehow talking about Israel-Palestine was going to cause harm to Jewish students. And so there's just been this firestorm of criticism.
What was the organization you understood brought the suit? I mean, it was brought on behalf of 3 anonymous University of Massachusetts students.
Yeah, that was just, I think that was just a scam. The lawsuit was brought by a group called Americans for Peace and Prosperity, which is a right-wing, really hate-filled group of reactionaries and bigots. And they started this about 4 weeks ago when they first heard about the panel. They then, I think, found some students at UMass to kind of front the injunction. But this is not a suit that's been brought by the students. This is a suit that is being brought by an external organization trying to shut down any kind of critical speech around Israel-Palestine. And I'm very happy that the university and the chancellor has held so firm to the principle of academic freedom and has not at all interfered with our planning for the event.
Talk more about the university standing up to the protests, saying the panel would move forward. And then, of course, you have the judge hearing this case yesterday, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, as I said, I've been the university has been steadfast in its defense of academic freedom. They try to take what they call a kind of content-neutral approach, saying this is not about this particular issue, but this is about the ability of the university and faculty to sponsor events that talk to the main issues of the day, as controversial as they may be. And the university has not budged from that at all. I have to tell you, I have not even heard from the chancellor with any kind of concerns whatsoever. And I think that is a great credit to the university.
I want to turn right now to Rachel Weber, who is joining us from Western Massachusetts. She's an attorney and member of Jewish Voice for Peace of Western Massachusetts chapter. Can you talk about your involvement in the court case yesterday, Rachel?
I'm sorry, can
you talk about your involvement in the court case yesterday? What Jewish Voice for Peace, one of the co-sponsors of this event that is set to take place tomorrow, what you said to the court?
Certainly. So we intervened as defendants in the case because we wanted to make sure that the judge and the court was able to hear our concerns contesting the plaintiff's use of a definition of anti-Semitism that conflates anti-Semitism with any criticism of Israel. And so we argued to the court, first of all, that allowing the injunction absolutely would have been a prior restraint on free speech, which is impermissible according to the First Amendment, and the judge was very clear on that. And then we also argued to the judge, and both in front of in open court and also with our filings, that the plaintiff's use of a definition of anti-Semitism, which includes any criticism of Israel and any advocacy for Palestinians, is both incorrect, inflammatory, and offensive to Jews, Jewish communities, and also historically inaccurate.
We're going to break, and when we come back from our break, we're going to turn to Roger Waters, the legendary musician, co-founder of Pink Floyd. He's one of the panelists set to speak on Saturday. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome one day. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome one day. And we'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. Every faith and every man. One day. And deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. tear down those prison walls. Together we will tear down those prison walls on that day. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we will tear
That's
down all.
Roger Waters performing We Shall Overcome, accompanied by Alexander Roatan on cello in the Democracy Now! Studios. We Shall Overcome. It is Pete Seeger's, well, the 100th anniversary of the late, great folk singer and songwriter. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Not backing down. Israel, free speech, and the battle for Palestinian human rights. That's the title of the panel set to take place Saturday at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. 3 anonymous UMass students filed a lawsuit to stop the event, claiming they'll, quote, suffer irreparable harm if it takes place. But Judge Robert Ullman ruled on Thursday the event can proceed, saying, quote, there's nothing that comes even close to a threat of harm or incitement to violence or lawlessness. Meanwhile, the university's backed the event despite the protests, saying it's committed to the principles of free speech and academic freedom. So we're joined right now by Pink Floyd founder Roger Waters, who is one of the participants in that event. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank
And
you.
talk about why you're doing this on Saturday and the significance of the court ruling.
Well, Sir asked me to come to his university to be on this panel, and I'm delighted to be able to do it. Thank you, Judge. He was very explicit and brief and to the point, and his ruling is obviously sound. My view is that it's a good thing that that the organisations are attacking the event, because what it does is it serves to shine light on the predicament of the Palestinian people who we support. And the more light that is shone in any question of human rights, the better, in my view. So I'm very glad that they've failed. Though, in a way, if they had succeeded in their legal manoeuvres, that might have gone even further to shine light on the predicament of the Palestinians, which is what this is about. You know, something that I say at every show I do now, because I find my speeches down so they're very short, is at some point in everybody's life they have to decide whether or not they believe in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Paris. If you do, either you believe in it or you don't. You can't have it both ways. And so if you do believe it, then you have to stand up for people's human rights all over the world, irrespective of their ethnicity or their religion or their nationality, which is what we are doing in this panel at the University of Massachusetts on Saturday.
Can you talk about the backlash against pro-Palestinian voices, including the backlash that you, Roger Waters, have experienced as a musician, as a human rights activist, as you travel the world?
Well, this particular issue is far more divisive than any other. So I've just been on tour for a couple of years all over the world, and in many countries, certainly in Europe, in France and in Germany, I came up against an absolute wall of silence, really, particularly in Germany, where nobody in the press, until I spoke to one journalist with a newspaper from Munich, nobody would speak to me, on the grounds that they'd been told that I was anti-Semitic and that I could not be spoken to. And the Germans are very sensitive about Jewish affairs. And in consequence, they are not open to even speaking about human rights within the context of Palestine.
Can you talk about the equation of being critical of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism?
Well, I could talk about it, yeah, but what's the point? So much...
Respond to it.
Okay, well, it's quite clearly criticism of any government is nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and certainly criticism of the Israeli government's flouting of international law and abuses of human rights has nothing to do with the Jewish faith or Jewish people. I've had lots of meetings all over the world with JVP-sponsored events.
Jewish Voice for Peace.
Actually, we did one in... the first one we did after I left the States was in Vancouver, and it wasn't JVP, but it was another Jewish organization, I can't remember, something other voices. And of course, they are just as humane and care just as much about human rights as everybody else does who cares about human rights. Unfortunately, the Israeli government does not care about human rights, and neither does this government in this country, which is why this administration is supporting the annexing of the Golan Heights and the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. So it is very important that those of us who do care organize, meet, have meetings, and continue to protest the situation of our Palestinian friends.
I wanted to bring Rachel Weber back into this conversation to address this particular issue of equating being critical of the state of Israel, of the current government in Israel, with being anti-Semitic. You're an attorney and member of Jewish Voice for Peace.
Yes. Zionism is a political movement. And from the very beginning of that movement in the late 19th century, there's been dissent within Jewish communities around whether or not Zionism was a good idea. And in fact, right around when the Balfour Declaration was about to be enacted, which gave a mandate for essentially was the beginnings of the establishment of the State of Israel through the British mandate, there were several prominent Jewish members of the British Jewish community that issued a statement in the Times of London about how this was a dangerous idea. So there's been discussion and debate and disagreement about Zionism from the very beginning within Jewish communities. So to say that all Jews feel that the Israeli government speaks for them is, again, it's inaccurate and it's incredibly offensive. I have an absolute obligation to protest injustices that are happening in my name, both as a Jew and as an American, given the amount of aid and military resources that this country gives to Israel. It's actually quite offensive to suggest that just because of the identities of the people who are running the government in Israel, that because I share some heritage with those people's identities, that I would support anything that they do. And there's a growing voice in this country and around the world of Jews saying Israel does not speak for us, and we have to speak up against the human rights abuses that are happening against Palestinians, and to say that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, it's incredibly dangerous, and it's actually bad for Jews because it prevents us from doing the hard work that has to happen to contest white supremacy. White supremacy is what is dangerous for Jews in this country and around the world. And when we use a definition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel, that actually divides us from internally. It's a huge divide within the Jewish community in this country, and it also separates us from allies in working together to fight white supremacy. So it's actually it's dangerous, obviously, for Palestinians, because it makes anyone who stands up for Palestinian rights fear that they're going to be accused of being anti-Semitic and smeared, just like in this lawsuit. And it's also dangerous for Jews because it prevents us from working together internally and with allies to fight white supremacy. I want to bring in Set Jolly again from the University of Massachusetts, professor of communications, head of the Media Education Foundation. According to reports, you'd hope to bring the Palestinian leader and activist Hanan Ashrawi, but she didn't receive a visa in time. Is this true, and what do you understand happened?
Yes, it's very true. When I was organizing the event, I sent an invitation to Hanan Ashrawi, and she replied and said she very much wanted to come, but she was waiting for a visa, and that she would be back in touch with me, if she got the visa. And she got back in touch with me about 2 months later and said, that she could not include the United States in anything she was going to do because she was not receiving a visa. And so, Hanan has been coming to the United States for decades. And I don't know if people know, but, she's a famed Palestinian legislator, elected representative of the Palestinian people. And she cannot now come into the country to talk about the issues that confront Palestinians. And this goes along with just 2 weeks ago, Marwan Barghouti, the co-founder of BDS, was denied a visa to come in. So I think what is happening at UMass is a kind of microcosm of what's happening everywhere. There is this kind of intense pressure now to make sure that the pro-Palestinian voices or any kind of rational discussion of Israel-Palestine does not happen. At UMass, it's to do with, it's the phone calls, it's the letters that came in, it's the lawsuit. And I think this is an act of desperation on their part. For example, they knew the injunction would never stop this event from taking place. And so the question is, why did they go through with it? Why did they spend the thousands of dollars on the lawyers to go, to go through the courts? And I think it was not an attempt to stop this event because they knew they couldn't. It was an act of intimidation and bullying for the next one. To tell people, if you start to think about organizing events around this or start speaking out about this, this is what's going to come down on you. And I think they're petrified. I think they are terrified of the coalitions that are being building between Palestinian students and Jewish students in organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine. They're terrified of the links that are taking place between the battle for black liberation in the United States and the battle for liberation in Palestine. And they want to destroy those and make sure that those voices are not heard through intimidation and threat. But the name of our panel is called Not Backing Down. Because I think we're in a new moment right now where there is a space for different kinds of voices to come through. And people are not backing down and are forcing this conversation into the mainstream.
That was actually Omar Barghouti, one of the organizers of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, who was not allowed into the United States despite the fact that he's come here many other times and was also coming for his daughter's wedding. People can see the interview we did with him at DemocracyNow.org. We also recently spoke to Noam Chomsky, the world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. He said Democrats are supporting Palestinian rights more now than in the past. He said times have changed.
The support for Israeli expansionism, repression, the whole alliance that's developing, that support has shifted in the United States from the more liberal sectors, roughly the Democratic Party, to the far right. Not very long ago, support for Israel was based passionately in the liberal sectors of the population. It was a democratic issue. It isn't anymore. In fact, if you look at in the polls, people who identify themselves as liberal, as Democrats, by now tend to support Palestinian rights more than Israel. That's a dramatic change. Support for Israel now is in the most reactionary parts of the population. Evangelical Christians, ultra-nationalists, basically it's a far-right issue. Among younger people, this is even more the case.
That was Noam Chomsky, who had just returned to Boston, to Massachusetts. I was interviewing him at the Old South Church there, about 1,000 people packed into the church. Roger Waters, do you feel that kind of optimism? That, I mean, here Noam Chomsky has been so critical of the Israeli state for so long, and yet he says he feels there is a different climate right now. Absolutely.
I mean, I've been involved in this struggle only for the last 12 years, but over those 12 years, it has changed dramatically. And Noam Chomsky is exactly right. And so is Sut. They are desperate now. That's why they pulled this silly legal stunt about this meeting in UMass. And I'm so happy to see it. And working with people from Jewish Voice for Peace and other Jewish organizations as well has developed dramatically over the years as the demographic within the Jewish community in the United States has changed, and they're coming more and more round to saying, not in my name, and which is hugely encouraging. Yeah, I feel overcome almost with joy even to be able to speak about it in these terms now. And I'm really looking forward to Saturday in Massachusetts and having, you know, speaking to young people and meeting also the other panelists, all of whom I'm admire.
Why risk this criticism? I mean, you are a world-renowned musician, and yet you take this on everywhere you go. Why?
My mum. You know, my mother, when I was young, at one point, she said to me, you know, at some point in your life, you're going to be faced with difficult decisions. You should think about things, find out as much as you can about anything that you're confronted with, then make up your own mind what it is that you're going to do. There's nearly always the right thing to do. Just do it. This is the right thing to do, and I'm just doing it. So there's never any sort of question about it.
And what message do you have to other musicians and artists?
Get on board. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues in my industry are still very frightened of the industry and of the power in the industry of the Israeli lobby. Just the same as members of Congress are still terrified of AIPAC and the people who fund their elections. And so that is still there, but it's diminishing. It's
been quite remarkable to see the number of Democratic presidential candidates who did not address AIPAC this year.
It was a huge change, yeah, and hugely encouraging to us all.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. Roger Waters, co-founder of Pink Floyd, Sat Jali, University of Massachusetts Amherst professor, founder of the Media Education Foundation, and Rachel Weber, attorney and member of Jewish Voice for Peace of Western Massachusetts. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in 30 seconds.
Sola voy con mi pena, sola va mi condena. Correr es mi destino para burlar la ley, perdida en el corazón de la grande Babilón. Me dicen clandestino por no llevar papel. Pa' una ciudad del norte yo me fui a trabajar. Mi vida la dejé entre Tijuana y Bagdad.
The acclaimed Mexican singer Lila Downs performing here in our Democracy Now! Studios. It was a cover of the Manu Chao classic Clandestino. Her new album, El Chile, is out today. Visit democracynow.org to see the full performance and interview in our studio. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to two award-winning teachers who are trying to teach Trump a lesson. On Monday, Jessica Duenas, the 2019 Kentucky State Teacher of the Year, and Kelly Holstein, the 2019 Minnesota Teacher of the Year, boycotted a White House ceremony honoring them and other state winners of the award to protest the Trump administration's education policies. But Duenas and Holstein skipped the event to register their opposition to Trump's policies on immigration, education, and LGBTQ rights, saying many of the White House policies directly impact their immigrant and refugee students. Well, Democracy Now's Nermeen Sheikh and I sat down with Kelly Holstein, an English high school teacher at Takata Learning Center in Shakopee, Minnesota, and Jessica Duenas, a sixth-grade special ed teacher at the W.E.B. Du Bois Academy in Louisville, Kentucky. Duenas is the daughter of a Cuban refugee mother, a Latina mother, a Cuban refugee father, a Latina mother who at one point was undocumented immigrant in the U.S. They joined us from Washington, D.C. I began by asking Kelly Holstein why she decided to boycott the Monday White House ceremony.
I spent a lot of time thinking about this decision. I acknowledge that it's an honor, that it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be in the White House, and I I respect that location and the position, and I really respect the folks in our cohort who chose to be a part of that. And I'm very much a believer in freedom of speech, and I support that everyone shows that and demonstrates that right in different ways. And we also want to celebrate the National Teacher of the Year, Rodney Robinson, and we celebrate and champion and support him. But we needed to make our own choice about what felt right for us. And for me, I work at a school that is extremely diverse. It's an alternative high school in Shakopee, and the policies and the words and the actions of this administration show a great deal of discrimination and prejudice and hatred toward the students that I serve. And I could not, in good conscience, even implicitly support people who hate my kids. Also, as a gender nonconforming lesbian, there have been, if you look on the GLAAD website, I think to date there's 104 attacks against my community, against my LGBTQ community. And I want to model for my students that even though you can respect someone's position, you also can have healthy boundaries and decide what's right for you. I don't generally go into other people's homes if I know that they hate me for who I am without ever actually knowing anything about me. And so I really want to model for students that they can make those choices for themselves about what feels healthy for them. But at the end of the day, I can't actively or implicitly support an administration who treats my kids very, very poorly.
In what way do they do that, Kelly? That's strong language. You can't support or didn't want to meet with people who hate your children. You were going to be meeting with, Betsy DeVos, Pence, and President Trump. How do they hate your children?
Right. Well, if you look at the words and the actions and the policies, the attacks against LGBTQ people, the attacks against immigrants and refugees and people of the global majority and American Indians and people with disabilities, there are so many statements that are made that are negative. And it also creates an environment and a culture in our country that emboldens people who have that hatred and that fear of others. And it causes those folks to be more verbal with their language. For example, I have a student who is Muslim and she's Somali and she wears a hijab. And every time she's in public, people yell at her and call her a terrorist and tell her to go back home. And she is the kindest human I've ever met. She gives the best hugs of anyone in the world. She is sweet and sassy and smart, and she is articulate. And she could so easily hate the world because of the way that she's being treated. And she chooses not to hate the world. She chooses to come from a place of light and love. And I can't support someone who hates someone like that. And in my classroom, I really support healthy communication and discussion and differences of opinion, but there has to be ground rules for it to be healthy and productive. So in my classroom, we respect each other's opinions, but there's no space for prejudice or discrimination, and you can't attack other people. So if I were to actually have an open opportunity to talk to members of this administration, to Mr. Trump or Mr. Pence or Ms. DeVos, then I would welcome that if they would follow the ground rules. And experience has taught us that there's a lot of attacking statements, there's a lot of prejudice, there's a lot of discrimination. I wouldn't expect my students to participate in a conversation like that because it's not healthy and it's not productive.
Jessica Duenas, can you talk about the decision you made once you got this really incredible honor to be the 2019 Teacher of the Year of Kentucky, then coming to Washington and deciding not to meet with President Trump and Vice President Pence and the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos?
Absolutely. So when I first learned that I won the award, I was informed that I would have the honor of meeting the president and, members of the administration. Like I said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that I chose to miss out on. And there's several reasons why. First, Kentucky is my adopted home. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and I came to Kentucky 7 years ago because I married someone from Louisville. And when we divorced 2 years ago, I could have gone back home, but I felt very rooted in, at that time I was teaching in Oldham County Schools, which is a semi-rural county outside of Louisville. And I loved my students, and I loved the friendships that I had made and the connections that I made. So at that point, I felt like a Kentuckian. Kentucky is home, even though I don't have the accent clearly. But, after 7 years, that's my home. And as a representative and having the honor to represent this state, one of the biggest issues that Kentucky is facing right now in terms of education is adequately funding our public schools. As you know, Kentucky is a state that struggles a lot financially. We experience a lot of rural poverty, especially if you look at Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky, the rural areas, even our urban areas. I live in an urban area. There is vast poverty throughout the state, and it looks very different depending on the area. And so throughout the state, we have students who lack resources and have incredible barriers to their learning because their teachers might not have technology or basic materials to enable these students to learn. And so if we allow the privatization agenda that the Trump administration is pushing and also the state administration right now in Kentucky is pushing to happen, the funding that is already barely there for our public schools is going to diminish and get even worse. And so let's say we suddenly let in these scholarship tax credits. Now these families are able to pull public school funds that could have helped many children and take them out into schools that are not really being regulated. For example, if charter schools were to come into Kentucky, because Kentucky right now doesn't have any charters, you put these charter schools in, suddenly you're putting teachers that don't have to be highly qualified educators to teach our children. So you might have, and you know, for example, I'm a teacher of students with disabilities. Charter schools don't necessarily have to take students like the ones that I teach, which are very high need students. So for me, I'm very passionate about that. And the fact that just a few weeks ago, Ms. DeVos came to Kentucky to have a conversation about education, a roundtable discussion, and she met with the governor and the commissioner. But there wasn't a single public school representative there, and students showed up. Public school students showed up who wanted to see what was happening and I guess go back to their schools and report it. They were turned away. What a slap in the face to the state of Kentucky from our federal administration. So how could I, in good faith, representing the state as a state teacher of the year, come to Washington, smile and nod, and, you know, kind of put on a show for the administration when the administration couldn't even respect the state when they sent a representative there? The second piece to why I did not want to face the administration was I'm a first-generation American, as you mentioned in my bio. My father, a Cuban refugee, had to cut sugarcane in Cuba for 2 years without pay just to be released by the administration back then so that he could come to this country in search of a better life. My mother entered legally, which is why she was ultimately able to get her citizenship. She entered legally and overstayed her visa to work. And because of the sacrifices that my parents made, I am now a special education teacher of 11 years. And let's go back to the civil rights movement. What would it look like to my students if their Latina teacher, gets called an animal by the president, and then I have to go shake his hand? What message am I sending my African-American male students? That when people in power dehumanize you, you smile and nod? Or do I teach them and remind them, hey, back in the 60s, what did Martin Luther King do? He spoke up. What did John Lewis do? He spoke up. What did Rosa Parks do? She spoke up. What did the Freedom Riders do? They spoke up. And hey, they went through great consequences.
Well, I'd like to turn to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. In March, she refused to state whether schools should be allowed to discriminate against students based on sexual orientation or gender identity. This is DeVos being questioned by Wisconsin Democrat Mark Pocan during testimony before a House Education Appropriations Subcommittee.
Do you think it's all right for a school to discriminate based on someone's sexual orientation or gender identity?
We have laws that cover discriminatory efforts, and our Office for Civil Rights has continued to be very diligent in investigating any allegation of discrimination and will continue to do so.
So is that a yes or is that a no? I'm trying to get a yes or no, I guess, on that.
We follow the law as this.
So personally, you don't have an opinion on it?
Defined, and
because you are giving money, so it leads me to the next question. You are giving money to some charter schools that do discriminate.
So that was Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Meanwhile, Second Lady of the United States, Karen Pence, is working at a Virginia private school that explicitly bans LGBTQ workers and students. Pence is teaching at the Emmanuel Christian School in Washington, D.C. suburbs, where an employment application requires job candidates to pledge not to engage in homosexual activity or to violate the, quote, unique roles of male and female female. The application also advises women that, quote, a wife is commanded to submit to her husband as the church submits to Christ, unquote. So, Kelly Holstein, could you respond to what DeVos said, and also Vice President Pence's wife?
It hurts my heart, because what if a student, while in Mrs. Pence's care, begins to figure out who they are in this world? And what if they figure out that they're gay or lesbian or bi or trans, and they look to their teachers for that support and that love and that safety to be who they are? The suicide rate is 5 times higher for our LGBTQ community than it is for our heterosexual community and youth. And so these youth are going to feel isolated and lonely and unsupported, and it really hurts my heart for those youth to be in an environment that is so openly full of hate and discrimination towards something that they have no choice about.
That's Kelly Holstein, the 2019 Minnesota Teacher of the Year, and Jessica Duenas, the 2019 Kentucky State Teacher of the Year. They boycotted the White House ceremony honoring all 50 state winners of the award in protest of the Trump administration. And we end today's show with the words of the late folk singer and activist Pete Seeger. He was born 100 years ago today. In 2004, Pete Seeger came into our Firehouse studio.
Pete Seeger, can you tell us about We Shall Overcome?
I thought in 1946, when I learned it from a white woman who taught in a union labor school, the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, that the song had been made up in 1946 by tobacco workers, because they sang it out there to strike through the winter of 1946 in Charleston, South Carolina. And they taught the song to Zilphia Horton, the teacher at the labor school. And she said, oh, my favorite song. And I printed it in our little magazine in New York, People's Songs, as We Will Overcome in 1947. It was a friend of mine, Guy Carawan, who made it famous. He picked up my way of singing it, We Shall Overcome. Although there was another teacher there, Septima Clark, a black woman. She felt that shall, like me, she felt it opened up the mouth better than will. So that's the way she sang it. Anyway, Guy Carawan in 1960 taught it to the young people at the founding convention of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC for short. And a month later, it wasn't a song, it was the song throughout the South.
You sang it for Martin Luther King?
In 1957, I went down to Highlander. Zilphia was dead, and Miles Horton, her husband, said, we can't have a celebration of 25 years of this school without music. Won't you come down and help lead some songs? So I went down, and Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy came up from Alabama to say a few words. And I sang a few songs, and that was one of them. And Braden drove King to a speaking engagement in Kentucky the next day, and she remembers him sitting in the back seat saying, we shall overcome. That song really sticks with you, doesn't it? But he wasn't a song leader. It wasn't until another 3 years that Guy Carawan made it famous.
The late folk singer and activist Pete Seeger speaking in 2004. He was born 100 years ago today. You can watch that full interview and all of our interviews with Pete Seeger on our website at DemocracyNow.org. You can also sign up for our daily email, our headlines and news alerts. Just text the word Democracy Now, one word, to 66866. That's Democracy Now, 66866. Democracy Now! Has an immediate opening for our paid full-time digital fellowship here in New York City. We also are accepting applications for paid 6-month internships. Learn more at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.